In the dense, forgotten hills of southern Appalachia, where the Spanish moss hangs from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and the very air feels heavy with unspoken history, lies the crumbling ruin of what was once known as the Ellington Sanctuary for Wayward Youth. For decades, it was a name spoken with reverence, a testament to the philanthropic spirit of its founders, a beacon of hope in a world still reeling from the chaos of the Great War. But the slow, inexorable march of time has peeled back the veneer of respectability, and the forest that so patiently awaited its moment to reclaim the land has recently been forced to give up its darkest secrets. In the spring of 2024, during a preliminary survey for a controversial new logging route, a backhoe operator struck something that was not rock or root. What followed was a slow, painstaking excavation that would unearth a horror that defied all local legend, a truth far more terrifying than any ghost story whispered by generations of townsfolk. 143 unmarked graves were discovered. Then the count rose to 200. Then it surpassed 300. A silent, buried congregation of the lost and the forgotten. In the wake of this ghastly discovery, sealed archives were opened and long-suppressed documents were brought into the light, chief among them a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the elegant, increasingly frantic script of a young woman named Elara Vance, a governess who served at the sanctuary in the 1920s. Her testimony, dismissed in its time as the ravings of a troubled mind, now serves as a chilling Rosetta Stone, translating the cold, hard language of forensic evidence into a narrative of unimaginable human cruelty. The story of the Ellington family and their sinister sanctuary is not just a forgotten piece of local lore. It is a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about a celebrated chapter of regional history, revealing a macabre enterprise of death and deceit operating under the guise of Christian charity. It is a story that was almost perfectly erased. What you are about to hear is a reconstruction of those events, a journey into one of the darkest chapters of American history. Be warned, the path we are about to walk is a grim one, filled with details that are both disturbing and deeply unsettling. This channel isn't for everyone. It is for those brave souls, those seekers of the difficult truth, who believe that the darkest corners of our past must be illuminated, lest we forget the lessons they hold. If you are one of us, subscribe now and hit the notification bell, so you never miss an investigation into the stories that have been deliberately buried. And in the comments below, let us know what part of the world you're watching from, as we build this global community of historical truth seekers. For now, steel yourselves as we travel back a century, to a time of great hope and even greater shadow, to witness the rise of the Ellington family and the idyllic, benevolent institution that would become their abattoir. The early 20th century in America was a crucible of profound change, a period of immense industrial growth shadowed by the specter of global conflict and the social upheaval it left in its wake. The nation was grappling with the consequences of the First World War, an event that had not only reshaped the map of Europe, but had also fractured countless families, leaving a tragic flotsam of orphans, widows, and displaced souls. In this era of turmoil and transition, a new breed of philanthropists emerged, men and women of vision and means who sought to impose order on the chaos, to build institutions that would mend the torn fabric of society. Among these figures, none shone more brightly, nor cast a longer and more sinister shadow than Dr. Alastair Ellington. To the public in the 1910s and 20s, Dr. Ellington was the very embodiment of enlightened progressivism. A physician by training, with a family fortune rooted in timber and railroads, he possessed a rare combination of scientific authority and almost hypnotic charisma. His speeches, delivered from church pulpits and the stages of civic halls across the state, were masterpieces of oratory, weaving together themes of Christian duty, patriotic responsibility, and the promise of a brighter future forged through discipline and care for the most vulnerable. He spoke of the nation's children as its most precious resource, the living seeds of a new and better America, and he lamented the squalor and moral peril they faced in the teeming, anonymous cities. His solution was as grand as his rhetoric, a sanctuary, a place far removed from the corrupting influence of urban life, where these children could be reshaped, educated, and imbued with the values of hard work and piety. Thus, in 1912, the Ellington Sanctuary for Wayward Youth was born. The location itself was a masterstroke of stagecraft. Nestled deep within a vast 1,000-acre tract of family-owned land, the sanctuary was accessible only by a single, winding private road. The isolation was framed as a feature, not a bug. It was a place where the outside world's temptations and dangers could not intrude. The main building was a sprawling Victorian mansion, repurposed for its new role, with a fresh coat of white paint that gleamed against the dark, brooding green of the surrounding forest. Manicured lawns and meticulously planned gardens stretched out from the main house, creating an oasis of perfect order in the heart of the untamed wilderness. It looked less like an orphanage and more like a prestigious boarding school, a place parents would aspire to send their children. Photographs from the era, commissioned by Alistair himself for fundraising brochures, show smiling, well-dressed children engaged in wholesome activities, reading on the veranda, tending to flower beds, singing in a choir. The image was one of salvation, of idyllic childhoods reclaimed from the brink of despair. And at the heart of this perfect image stood the Ellington family, a trinity of seeming virtue. At Alistair's side was his wife, Dr. Isolde Ellington. Where Alistair was all soaring rhetoric and public charm, Isolde was his quiet, cerebral counterpart. A botanist and amateur chemist of considerable talent, she was presented as the nurturing heart of the sanctuary. Her official role was to oversee the institution's health and nutrition, and her extensive gardens were not merely ornamental. They were a living laboratory for creating a self-sufficient, healthy environment. She cultivated medicinal herbs, developed vitamin-rich dietary plans, and was said to be able to cure common childhood ailments with her specially prepared herbal tonics. She rarely spoke in public, but her perceived scientific acumen lent a powerful air of legitimacy and modern thinking to her husband's grand project. Completing the trio was Marcus Thorne, Isolde's younger brother. Thorne was the grounded, practical element of the operation. A man of few words and an imposing physical presence, he was the estate manager, the enforcer of the daily routine. He oversaw the grounds, the maintenance, and the logistics of the sprawling property. He was seen as fiercely loyal to the Ellingtons and their mission, a man who ensured that Alistair's vision was executed with ruthless efficiency. To the outside world, to the donors who sent checks, and the local officials who lauded the sanctuary as a model institution, this was the perfect team. The visionary, the nurturer, and the loyal steward. They were bringing light to the darkest corners of society, offering a lifeline to those who had none. But as Alara Vance would soon discover, the gleaming white facade of the Ellington Sanctuary was designed to conceal a rot that went to the very bone, and the isolation that was meant to protect the children was, in fact, intended to ensure that their secrets would be kept forever. The fortress was not meant to keep the world out, it was meant to keep the victims in. In the autumn of 1922, a young woman named Alara Vance arrived at the end of the long, winding road that led to the Ellington Sanctuary. She carried with her a single suitcase and a heart full of earnest, optimistic ambition. A recent graduate of a modest teacher's college, she had been hired as a governess and instructor for the younger children, drawn in by one of Dr. Alistair Ellington's compelling advertisements, which promised not just a job, but a calling. She had read his pamphlets, seen the pristine photographs of the sanctuary, and believed she was stepping into a world crafted from benevolence and high ideals. Her first impressions did little to dispel this notion. Dr. Ellington greeted her personally on the grand columned porch, his voice as warm and resonant as she had imagined. He spoke of the sanctuary as a family, and of her new role as a sacred trust. The grounds were, if anything, more beautiful than the pictures, a testament to order and tranquility. Yet, even in those first few days, a subtle, disquieting dissonance began to creep into Alara's perceptions. The children, for instance, were not the boisterous, happy youths of the promotional materials. There was a strange quietness about them, a listlessness that clung to the air in the classrooms and dormitories. They were impeccably behaved, moving through their rigidly scheduled days with a conditioned precision that felt less like discipline and more like a profound, soul-wearying exhaustion. Their eyes, Alara wrote in the first entry of her journal, seemed like old glass, clouded over with something I could not name. She initially attributed this to their traumatic pasts, the very reason they were at the sanctuary to begin with. But the feeling of unease persisted, a low hum of wrongness beneath the placid surface of daily life. The architect of this unnatural order was Marcus Thorne. Elara quickly learned that while Dr. Ellington was the sanctuary's public face, Thorne was its ever-present, silent authority. He moved about the grounds with a heavy, deliberate tread, his gaze missing nothing. Fear followed him like a shadow. A dropped spoon in the dining hall, a whispered conversation after lights out, a moment of spontaneous play that broke the day's rigid schedule. All were met with Thorne's immediate, unnerving presence, followed by a swift, quiet removal of the offending child. What happened to them afterward was unclear, but they would return subdued and compliant, their eyes carrying a fresh layer of that glassy emptiness. It was the first true sign of trouble, a crack in the perfect veneer. The inciting incident, the moment that transformed Elara's vague apprehension into a sharp, specific dread, came about a month after her arrival. A young boy named Thomas, a bright and inquisitive child with whom Elara had formed a gentle bond, came down with a fever and a cough. It seemed a simple chest cold, something Elara had seen and tended to dozens of times. She recommended the standard course of care: rest, fluids, a warm compress. But she was swiftly overruled. Dr. Ellington, with a placid, dismissive smile, assured her that they had their own, more advanced methods. "Dr. Isolde has a far better handle on these matters," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Her tonics are remarkably effective." Thomas was moved to the small infirmary, a wing of the main house that was strictly Isolde Ellington's domain. Elara was not permitted to visit. She would catch glimpses of Isolde gliding silently down the hallway, carrying small, dark bottles. The infirmary door remained closed. 2 days later, Dr. Alistair Ellington gathered the children and staff in the main hall. With a voice full of practiced solemnity, he announced that young Thomas had, tragically, succumbed to a sudden and aggressive pneumonia. His constitution, so weakened by his prior life of neglect, was simply not strong enough to fight it, Alistair explained, his eyes sweeping across the room, a mask of profound sorrow perfectly in place. "He passed away peacefully in his sleep. He is with the Lord now." The explanation was plausible. It was tragic. And to Elara, it felt like a profound and terrible lie. She had seen Thomas just before he was taken to the infirmary. He was sick, yes, but not, she felt, mortally so. The speed of his decline, the secrecy surrounding his treatment, the placid finality of Alistair's announcement, it all coalesced into a cold knot of fear in her stomach. That night, she wrote in her journal, her hand shaking slightly. "They speak of his passing as a tragedy, but their eyes are calm, their sorrow a performance. It was not a fever that took him. Something is wrong in this place. The air is thick with it. It is a house of secrets, and I fear the children are the ones who pay the price for them." She was beginning to see that the sanctuary was not a place of healing. It was a place of control, and its methods were absolute. At the heart of the Ellington Sanctuary's web of control and deceit was Dr. Isolde Ellington, a figure who remained largely in the background, a specter of scientific detachment in a world her husband had built on fervent emotion. While Alistair charmed donors and mesmerized the public, Isolde engaged in a far more private, far more sinister form of creation. Her domain was a large, glass-paned greenhouse and an adjoining laboratory, situated at the far end of the property, well away from the main house and strictly forbidden to all but herself, her husband, and her brother. To the children, it was a place of myth and fear, known simply as Isolde's Garden. Elara, with her naturally inquisitive mind, found herself drawn to and deeply unsettled by it. The greenhouse, from a distance, was a beautiful structure, its glass panes catching the morning light. But up close, the plants visible through the glass were not the familiar flowers and vegetables that grew in the manicured beds near the mansion. They were strange, exotic specimens, with dark leaves and unusually shaped flowers, belladonna, foxglove, monkshood, and other species Elara could not identify, plants known as much for their potent toxicity as for any medicinal properties. The air around the greenhouse carried a peculiar, cloying scent, a mixture of sweet decay and the sharp, sterile bite of chemicals that seemed to drift from the ventilation fan of the attached laboratory. It was this laboratory that was the true heart of Isolde's operation, the sanctum sanctorum of her methodical cruelty. It was here that she perverted her considerable knowledge of botany and chemistry, transforming nature's bounty into instruments of submission and, ultimately, death. A pattern soon became chillingly clear to Alara. The children who exhibited defiance, the ones who asked too many questions, who retained a spark of unbroken will. These were the ones singled out for special treatments. Marcus Thorne would escort them from their dormitories, his hand firmly on their shoulder, leading them on the long walk to Isolde's garden. Dr. Alistair Ellington would explain it in his soothing, authoritative tone as a necessary intervention. "The child is suffering from a nervous affliction," he would say. "Dr. Ellington's restorative tonics will calm their spirit and help them adjust." They would be gone for a day, sometimes two. When they returned, they were irrevocably changed. The spark was gone, their eyes clouded with that same vacant, placid sheen Alara had first noticed upon her arrival. They moved slowly, spoke in monosyllables, and were models of perfect compliance. They were shells of their former selves. In her journal, Alara documented this horrific transformation. "James returned today," she wrote of a boy who had tried to run away. "Before, he was all fire and fury, a little warrior. Now, he sits by the window for hours, staring at nothing. His hands, which once were always busy building things from scraps of wood, now just lie open in his lap. I tried to speak to him, to ask him what they did to him. He only looked at me with those empty eyes and whispered, 'The garden is quiet.' I do not know what is in Dr. Ellington's dark bottles, but I know it is not medicine. It is a poison for the soul. It does not cure, it erases." Alara began to suspect that the tonics were not just sedatives. The children who received repeated treatments often grew pale and sickly, developing strange ailments that defied conventional explanation. Some wasted away slowly, their deaths eventually attributed to congenital weaknesses or failure to thrive. Others, particularly the most troublesome, or those who had witnessed something they shouldn't have, would disappear altogether. Alistair would announce with grave finality that a wonderful opportunity had arisen. A wealthy, childless couple from a distant state had requested to adopt the child immediately. It was a blessing, a miracle. There were no farewells. The child was simply gone, their belongings vanishing from the dormitory overnight, their name forbidden to be spoken again. Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that these children were not going to loving, new homes. They were the failed experiments, the evidence that needed to be disposed of. The beautiful, orderly sanctuary was a farm, and the children were its crop, cultivated, controlled, and, when necessary, culled by the methodical, dispassionate hand of Isolde Ellington. Her garden was not a place of life. It was a nursery for death. The gears of the Ellington family's Macabre machine could not have turned without the tireless, ruthless work of Marcus Thorne. If Alistair was the architect and Isolde the engineer of their criminal enterprise, Thorne was the foreman, the man who handled the grim, practical realities of their work with brutal efficiency. He was the enforcer, the gatekeeper, and the undertaker, a role for which his taciturn nature and intimidating presence were perfectly suited. His official title was estate manager, a deceptively mundane description for a job that encompassed human trafficking, corporal punishment, and the clandestine disposal of human remains. His days were a study in constant, menacing vigilance. He patrolled the 1,000-acre property with a shotgun cradled in his arm, not just for hunting game, but for ensuring the sanctuary's profound isolation remained absolute. He repaired the fences, maintained the locks, and was the sole operator of the estate's only motor vehicle, a black Ford truck that became a symbol of impending dread among the children. It was in this truck, under the cover of darkness, that Thorne performed one of his most crucial functions, the acquisition of new subjects. Several times a month, he would drive off late at night, returning in the pre-dawn hours with new children. These were not local orphans who might have relatives or concerned neighbors who could ask questions. As Alara would later piece together from the children's hushed, fearful whispers. They came from the slums and orphanages of distant industrial cities, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Cleveland. They were the children of poor immigrants, the undocumented, the forgotten, those whose disappearance would scarcely be noted, let alone investigated. Thorn was the first and last authority these children would know at the sanctuary. His rule was absolute and predicated on fear. Alara witnessed the full extent of his cruelty one afternoon, when two young sisters were caught sharing a piece of bread they had saved from lunchtime, a minor infraction of the strict rules against hoarding food. Thorn did not shout or raise his voice. He simply appeared, his large frame blocking the light in the doorway. He beckoned the older sister, a girl of no more than 10, to follow him to the woodshed behind the main house. The younger sister began to cry, a thin, terrified wail. The other children froze, a wave of collective fear washing over the schoolroom. Alara made a move to intervene, to protest that the punishment was disproportionate, but a single cold glance from Thorn stopped her in her tracks. It was a look that communicated a clear and unambiguous threat. He returned half an hour later, alone. The girl was confined to the infirmary for 3 days, for what Alistair Ellington described as a bout of hysteria. When she finally emerged, she walked with a limp, and a dark bruise bloomed on her cheek, a stark testament to Thorn's discipline. She never spoke of what happened in the woodshed, but she and her sister were models of silent compliance from that day forward. The sanctuary's isolation was Thorn's greatest weapon. The estate was a world unto itself, miles from the nearest town of Blackwood Creek. There was no telephone line, and the mail was collected and delivered only by Thorn on his weekly trips for supplies. He was the sole conduit to the outside world, a choke point he controlled with absolute authority. This physical and informational isolation created a perfect prison. For the children, there was no escape. The dense, forbidding forest that surrounded the property was as effective as any wall, and Thorn's constant patrols made any attempt a suicidal gesture. For Alara, this isolation became a source of mounting claustrophobia. She was as much a prisoner as the children, her every move observed, her connection to her past life severed. The beautiful sanctuary, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a fortress, a tomb. It was an island of despair in a sea of whispering pines, and Marcus Thorn was its grim, ever-watchful warden. Before we delve deeper into the systematic horrors that Alara Vance began to uncover, let's take a moment. The story from this point forward descends into even darker territory. If you appreciate this deep dive into a forgotten history and want to support the telling of these important, difficult stories, please take a second to like this video and share it with someone who won't shy away from the truth. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss the revelations that are to come as we uncover the true purpose behind the Ellingtons' monstrous work. Your support ensures these voices from the past are not silenced again. As the seasons turned at the Ellington Sanctuary, Alara Vance became an unwilling archivist of the lost. The initial unsettling incidents began to coalesce into a horrifying, undeniable pattern. The disappearances, once sporadic events cloaked in plausible explanations, accelerated, becoming a grimly routine feature of life at the isolated estate. A quiet, systematic culling was underway, and Alara, with a growing sense of both terror and duty, began to secretly document it. In the back pages of her journal, she started a list. It began with Thomas, the boy who had succumbed to Isolde's treatment. Soon, other names followed. There was Anya, a clever, resilient girl of 12 who had been overheard questioning the official story of another child's death. Alistair announced she had been reunited with a long-lost uncle in Chicago. Her bed was empty the next morning. There was Samuel, a strong, healthy boy of 15, who was one of the best workers on the estate's small farm. He vanished after complaining of a severe headache following one of Isolde's mandatory vitamin tonics. According to Alistair, a wealthy benefactor who owned a large ranch out west had been so impressed with Samuel's work ethic that he had offered to adopt him and make him his heir. The story was a fairy tale, a fantasy of good fortune that none of the remaining children dared to question aloud. But Alara saw the truth in their eyes, a shared, unspoken knowledge that to be singled out, for good or for ill, was a death sentence. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. It was not, as one might expect, the sickest or weakest children who were disappearing. On the contrary, it was often the healthiest, the brightest, the most defiant. The ones with a spark, a will, a light of their own. It was as if the Ellingtons were pruning the very qualities that might lead to resistance or escape. The process was always the same. Alastair Ellington, the charismatic minister of death, would deliver the news with his signature blend of sorrow and uplifting rhetoric. His performances were flawless. He could weep on command, his voice thick with emotion as he described the tragic, sudden onset of a rare blood disease or the miraculous, life-changing opportunity of a last-minute adoption. He would quote scripture, speak of God's mysterious ways, and assure the remaining children that their departed friend was in a better place. The local community, on the rare occasions they interacted with him on his trips to town, saw only a dedicated, heartbroken man struggling valiantly against the cruelties of fate. They saw a saint. Alara saw a monster. "He is an artist of a lie," she wrote in a particularly scathing entry. "He can sculpt a tragedy with his words, so perfectly formed that to doubt it feels like a sin. But I have seen him, moments after delivering a heart-rending eulogy for a child he has murdered, walk back to his study and pour himself a brandy, his face as placid and untroubled as a summer pond. The grief is a costume he wears, and when the performance is over, he takes it off. What is left beneath is a void." The sheer number of disappearances became staggering. By her second year, Alara's list contained over 30 names. 30 children who had existed, who had names and faces and small, fledgling hopes, who had now been utterly erased from the world. Their files in the office would be marked transferred or deceased, the paperwork all perfectly in order, a testament to the Ellingtons' meticulous planning. There were no bodies, no graves, no evidence for an outside observer to find. There were only empty beds, haunting silences in the dining hall, and the ever-growing list in Alara Vance's hidden journal. She was beginning to understand that the sanctuary was not a revolving door of rescue and adoption. It was a one-way street, a dead end disguised as a new beginning. The children brought in by Marcus Thorne in the dead of night were not being saved. They were being consumed, used up by the insatiable, unseen machinery of the Ellington enterprise. The question that now haunted Alara's every waking moment was no longer if, but why. What was the ultimate purpose of this elaborate, murderous charade? Alara Vance's journal, for all its harrowing detail, was a record of the how, the methodical cruelty, the disappearances, the reign of terror. It was a testament from a witness trapped within the walls of the horror. But it would take the cold, dispassionate lens of a modern investigation, nearly a century later, to uncover the why. What Alara could only guess at, what she correctly identified as a monstrous evil, was underpinned by a motive as old and as common as humanity itself, greed. The narrative woven by Dr. Alastair Ellington, the one of a selfless philanthropist pouring his family fortune into a charitable cause, was the most elaborate and successful lie of his entire career. While he preached of piety and sacrifice, he was meticulously constructing a complex and deeply cynical financial empire, built upon the lives of the children he claimed to be saving. The recent unsealing of the Ellington estate's financial records, long buried in a dusty county archive, tells the true story. The Ellington sanctuary was not a drain on Alastair's finances. It was a massive source of income. The scheme was as brilliant as it was depraved. First, there was the fundraising. Alastair's charisma was a magnet for the wallets of the wealthy. He targeted industrialists, society matrons, and church congregations, painting a vivid picture of his noble work. The donations poured in vast sums of money, given in good faith, by people who believed they were contributing to a noble cause. The ledgers show these donations being deposited, but they also show massive, regular withdrawals for operating expenses, capital improvements, and specialized medical supplies. Vague terms that disguised a systematic siphoning of funds directly into Alastair's personal accounts. This was, however, only the most conventional part of his fraud. The true genius of his financial evil lay in how he monetized the children themselves. Upon arrival at the sanctuary, each child, stripped of their past and their identity, became a financial instrument. Alistair, using his authority as their legal guardian, took out multiple life insurance policies on each of them. He used different companies, spread the policies out over time, and ensured the premiums were paid with donated funds. When a child tragically passed away from a sudden illness, an illness induced by Isolde's poisons, Alistair would file the claim. The sanctuary's isolation and his own reputation as a respected physician meant that the death certificates he signed were never questioned. The payouts were substantial. But even this was not the extent of it. The investigation into the modern discovery of the graves has cross-referenced the names from Alara's journal with census records and other historical documents. A horrifying pattern has emerged. Some of the children who disappeared into the arms of wealthy benefactors did, in a sense, resurface. Records show young individuals with matching names and ages appearing as unpaid laborers in mines, factories, and remote rural estates owned by some of Alistair's most generous and most discreet donors. It appears Alistair was not just murdering children. He was trafficking them, selling the healthiest and strongest into a life of indentured servitude. The adoption stories were a cover for a high-stakes human trafficking ring, catering to a clientele of powerful men who needed a supply of untraceable labor. In this grotesque triumvirate of evil, each Ellington played their perfect part. Alistair, the charismatic leader, was the master of the financial web, charming the rich while orchestrating the fraud. Isolde, the methodical specialist, provided the scientific means of disposal, creating the illnesses that led to insurance payouts and eliminating the children who were too weak or too defiant to be sold. And Marcus Thorne, the practical enforcer, managed the supply chain, acquiring the raw material, the vulnerable children, and handling the grim logistics of their control and eventual disappearance. The realization, documented in Alara's journal, was a moment of profound, sickening clarity. She had overheard a rare argument between Alistair and a visiting businessman, a hushed, angry exchange about damaged goods, and a failure to deliver on a promise. The pieces clicked into place. "It is not a sanctuary," she wrote that night, the words scarred into the page. "It is a factory. It is a marketplace. They do not see children. They see assets. Some are to be liquidated for parts, others to be sold whole. And I am living in the slaughterhouse. I am witnessing how the sausage is made. God forgive me, what am I to do?" The sanctuary was a business, and its product was human suffering. The motive was not madness, not religious fervor, not scientific curiosity. It was cold, hard cash. The financial motives behind the Ellington sanctuary explained the why, but they did not fully account for the how. The insurance fraud and the trafficking required a steady, predictable, and controllable stream of death and disappearance. It required a method that was both effective and untraceable by the medical standards of the day. This is where Dr. Isolde Ellington's role transcended that of a mere accomplice and entered the realm of a truly monstrous innovator. The recent forensic examination of the skeletal remains unearthed on the property, when viewed alongside the descriptions in Alara Vance's journal, has painted a picture of medical horror that surpasses even Alara's worst fears. Isolde was not just poisoning the children. She was systematically experimenting on them. The mass grave was not just a cemetery. It was a repository of failed experiments, a clinical waste dump. Isolde, with her background in botany and chemistry, was a self-taught but brilliant toxicologist and pharmacologist. The isolation of the sanctuary provided her with the two things every unethical researcher dreams of: an unlimited supply of test subjects with no voice or agency, and a total lack of oversight. Her laboratory was not simply a place to mix poisons. It was a sophisticated facility for the development and testing of experimental compounds. The forensic anthropology reports on the recovered bones tell a chilling story. Many of the skeletons, particularly those of younger children, show evidence of severe chronic malnutrition, even though the sanctuary's official records boasted of a rich and healthy diet. This corroborates Ilara's descriptions of the pale, listless children. It's now believed Isolde was conducting cruel dietary experiments, testing the effects of vitamin and protein deprivation on human development. Other remains show strange bone densities and malformations, consistent with the administration of unknown chemical agents. Traces of heavy metals like arsenic and lead were found, but so were complex, unidentified organic compounds that have seeped into the bones. It appears Isolde was creating her own unique chemical cocktails. Her tonics, described by Ilara as the instruments of sedation, were likely the delivery mechanism for these trials. She was testing the efficacy of psychoactive and coercive drugs, refining formulas that could induce compliance, erase memory, or create a state of suggestibility. The children who became quiet and empty were the successful results of these psychological experiments. The ones who developed seizures, paralysis, or organ failure were the failures, and their bodies were disposed of by Marcus Thorne in the dead of night. In one of her most terrifying journal entries, Ilara described stumbling upon a small, leather-bound ledger that Isolde had accidentally left in the infirmary. It was not a patient chart, but a research notebook. It was filled with chemical formulas and meticulous notes, Ilara wrote. Each entry was a child's name, followed by a series of dates, dosages, and horrifyingly detached observations. Subject 74, male, age 9. Administration of compound delta 7. Initial observation, mild disorientation. 24 hours. Significant lethargy, pupil dilation. 48 hours. Auditory hallucinations reported. 72 hours. Catastrophic liver failure. Subject expired. Conclusion, dosage requires recalibration. It was the language of a scientist observing rats in a cage. We were the rats. This reveals a motive beyond greed, a secondary, even more perverse driver for Isolde. It was a monstrous, godlike sense of intellectual curiosity. She had the power of life and death, and she wielded it in the pursuit of her twisted science. She was not just a murderer. She was a vivisectionist of the human body and soul. The illnesses that befell the children were her creations. She could induce symptoms that mimicked pneumonia, diphtheria, or food poisoning with chilling accuracy, fooling any cursory examination. This allowed Alistair to confidently sign death certificates and collect insurance payouts, but for Isolde, the true reward was the data. She was, in her own mind, a pioneer, pushing the boundaries of medical knowledge in a laboratory where the only ethical constraint was the need to conceal the evidence. The full scope of her work is something we may never know. Her research notes, save for the one ledger Ilara saw, were likely destroyed. But the silent testimony of the bones tells us enough. The Ellington Sanctuary was not only a factory for profit. It was a private, horrific research institution where the price of knowledge was paid in the suffering and lives of hundreds of forgotten children. By the winter of 1924, Ilara Vance was no longer just a witness to the horrors of the Ellington Sanctuary. She was a prisoner, living on a knife's edge of terror and desperate calculation. The weight of her secret knowledge was a physical burden. Every placid smile from Alistair Ellington felt like a death threat. Every silent, passing glance from Isolde felt like a clinical assessment. And every heavy footstep of Marcus Thorne outside her door at night sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her veins. She knew, with the chilling certainty of a cornered animal, that her time was running out. She had become too observant, her questions too pointed in the beginning, her silences now too loud. She had seen the ledger. She knew the truth of the adoptions and the illnesses. It was only a matter of time before the Ellingtons decided she was a liability that needed to be managed in their permanent, final way. The idea of escape, once a distant, impossible fantasy, now became her singular, all-consuming obsession. But escape was a near impossibility. The sanctuary was a purpose-built prison. The 1,000 acres of dense, unfamiliar forest were a formidable natural barrier, especially in the harsh Appalachian winter. Marcus Thorne and his shotgun were an even more formidable human one. He had an uncanny sense of the estate, appearing as if from nowhere at the slightest irregularity. Any overt preparation for flight, hoarding food, stealing a map, preparing warm clothes, would be instantly noticed and would undoubtedly seal her fate. Her only hope was a desperate gamble, a plan that relied on deception, timing, and a great deal of luck. Her only weapon, the only thing of value she could take with her, was her journal. It was her testimony, the only proof that the dozens of missing children had ever existed. It was her reason for living, and likely the reason she would be killed. She began her preparations in secret, a shadow play of compliance. She forced herself to smile at Alistair, to praise Isolde's miraculous work, to appear cowed and obedient in the presence of Thorn. She played the part of a woman who had finally been broken, who had accepted the grim reality of the sanctuary and her place within it. Inside, she was a coiled spring of terror and resolve. She memorized the patrol patterns of Marcus Thorn, noting the 20-minute window just after 2 a.m. when he would check the generator at the far end of the property. She secretly mended her sturdiest walking boots and began wearing 2 layers of undergarments to bed, a small, desperate preparation for the cold. She wrapped her journal in oilcloth and hid it under a loose floorboard beneath her bed. The moment came on a moonless, bitterly cold night in February. A new shipment of children had arrived the night before, and the entire estate was unsettled. The Ellingtons and Thorn were occupied with a grim process of intake and assessment. Alara knew it was now or never. Feigning a sudden stomach illness, she was excused from the evening meal and confined to her room. This was the first part of her gamble, isolating herself without raising suspicion. As the house fell into its deep, fearful silence, she waited, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. At 1:45 a.m., she slipped out of bed, dressed in the dark, retrieved her precious journal, and crept to her window. The cold air hit her like a physical blow. The drop to the ground was a perilous 12 feet, but a thick, overgrown trellis, which Thorn had neglected to trim, ran down the wall just to the side. With her journal tied securely around her waist, she eased herself out the window. Her hands, numb with cold and fear, scraped against the rough wood of the trellis. A piece of it splintered, the sound as loud as a gunshot in the still night air. She froze, listening, expecting to see the beam of Thorn's flashlight, to hear his heavy boots on the frozen ground. But there was nothing, only the sighing of the wind in the pines. She scrambled the rest of the way down, landing heavily but without serious injury. She was out, but she was not safe. She was in the heart of the lion's den, with miles of dark, hostile territory to cross. She ran, not towards a main road, which she knew Thorn would check first, but directly into the deepest, most untamed part of the forest, praying the darkness and the dense undergrowth would cover her tracks. It was a harrowing, desperate flight through a frozen nightmare, every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sounding like a harbinger of her imminent capture. She did not know if her escape had been discovered, but she ran as if Marcus Thorn himself were breathing down her neck, his footsteps the echo of her own frantic heartbeat. Alara Vance's flight from the Ellington sanctuary was not a sprint to freedom, but a grueling marathon of survival. For 3 days, she moved through the dense, snow-dusted Appalachian wilderness, her only nourishment a few hardened biscuits she had managed to pocket, her only guide the position of the sun. The cold was a relentless enemy, seeping into her bones. Fear was her constant companion, a shadow that clung to her even in the brightest daylight. She imagined Marcus Thorn hunting her, moving through the woods with an expert's ease, and the thought propelled her forward when exhaustion screamed for her to stop. She finally stumbled out of the forest near a small, isolated logging camp, her clothes torn, her face and hands scratched and bruised, her body racked with a deep, consuming chill. The loggers, rough men unaccustomed to seeing a woman in such a state emerge from the deep woods, looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and pity. It was from them she learned she had traveled nearly 30 miles, a testament to her desperate endurance. They gave her food and a place by their fire, and the next day one of them agreed to take her by wagon to the nearest proper town with a sheriff's office, another 20 miles away. She arrived in the county seat of Oakhaven, a world away from the isolated tyranny of the sanctuary. Here, there were telephones, police officers, and the rule of law. Hope, a feeling she had long since abandoned, flickered faintly within her. She went directly to the sheriff, a portly, world-weary man named Blevins, and told her story. She laid her oilcloth-wrapped journal on his desk, its pages filled with the names of the dead, the details of the cruelty, the chronicle of a systematic slaughter. She spoke for hours, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion, laying bare the entire monstrous operation of the Ellington family. At first, Sheriff Blevins seemed to listen with genuine concern. He took notes, asked clarifying questions, and expressed his shock and horror at her allegations. He promised a full and immediate investigation. For a brief, shining moment, Ilara believed that justice was at hand, that the suffering of the children would finally be answered. But the tendrils of Dr. Alistair Ellington's influence reached much further than she could have ever imagined. The following day, a well-dressed lawyer from the state capital arrived in Oakhaven, representing Dr. Ellington. The narrative shifted with brutal, stunning speed. The official story, disseminated with practiced ease by the lawyer and reported with deference by the local newspaper, was that Ilara Vance was not a courageous whistleblower, but a troubled and hysterical young woman. It was claimed she had been dismissed from her post for emotional instability and for developing an unhealthy, obsessive fixation on Dr. Ellington. Her journal was painted as the fantasy of a disturbed mind, a work of lurid fiction created out of spite. Dr. Ellington himself made a rare public statement, expressing his deep sorrow and pity for the poor, delusional girl. He spoke of the immense emotional toll of caring for damaged children and suggested that Miss Vance, tragically, had been unequal to the task and had suffered a complete mental breakdown. He offered to pay for her care in a private sanatorium, a gesture that was widely seen as evidence of his boundless compassion. The system, which Ilara had placed her faith in, swiftly closed ranks to protect one of its own. Alistair Ellington was a wealthy, powerful man, a celebrated philanthropist with friends in high places. Ilara Vance was a nobody, an outsider with a wild, unbelievable story. Sheriff Blevins, who had initially seemed so sympathetic, became distant and dismissive. No official investigation was ever launched. No one drove up the winding road to the sanctuary to ask the hard questions. Ilara's testimony was buried, filed away, and labeled unsubstantiated. The Ellingtons had weathered the storm without a scratch. Ilara found herself in a terrifyingly vulnerable position. She was publicly discredited, branded as mentally unstable, and the Ellingtons' offer of care felt like a thinly veiled threat of imprisonment, or worse. The lawyer's veiled warnings made it clear her life was in danger. With the help of a skeptical, low-level clerk in the sheriff's office who had quietly believed her story, she was given a small amount of money and a warning to disappear. She fled Oakhaven that night, taking a train west under an assumed name. Her heroic effort to expose the truth had failed. The machine was too powerful, the lies too well-crafted. She was forced into a life of hiding, her story suppressed, her precious journal the only remaining proof of a truth the world had refused to see. Back at the Ellington sanctuary, the culling continued, the silence of the forest once again secure, its secret safe. The failure of Ilara Vance's desperate attempt at exposure emboldened the Ellingtons. With their reputation secured and their accuser silenced, the last significant threat to their operation was neutralized. For several more years, into the late 1920s and early 1930s, the sanctuary continued its grim work. The black Ford truck driven by Marcus Thorne continued its nocturnal journeys, bringing fresh victims to feed the machine. Isolde's garden continued to bloom with its strange, toxic flora, and her laboratory continued its ghastly research. Alistair's star, far from being tarnished, seemed to shine even brighter, his public persona burnished by the ordeal of having to deal with a hysterical employee, an act for which he was widely pitied and admired. The flow of donations and insurance payouts continued unabated. But no empire, no matter how carefully constructed, lasts forever. The eventual closure of the Ellington Sanctuary in 1937 was not the result of a dramatic raid or a long overdue investigation. It was a quiet, deliberate dissolution, as meticulously planned as its founding. The reasons were likely manifold. The Great Depression had shifted the economic landscape, perhaps making the flow of both donations and suitable victims less reliable. The children of the post-war boom were growing up, and the social conditions that had created such a large pool of vulnerable, untraceable orphans were changing. Furthermore, Alistair, Isolde, and Marcus were getting older. The sheer effort of maintaining such a complex, high-stakes criminal enterprise for over 2 decades must have been immense. The risk of exposure, however small, was ever present. Having amassed a colossal, untraceable fortune, they simply decided it was time to retire. The end came quietly. Dr. Ellington announced that, with a heavy heart, he was closing the sanctuary. His official reason was his own declining health and the fact that the orphan crisis had, thanks to the good work of institutions like his own, largely abated. He claimed the remaining children had all been placed in loving, permanent homes, a final, chilling echo of a lie he had told hundreds of times before. There was a final lavish fundraising dinner to provide for the future of the last generation of sanctuary children, a last, audacious fleecing of the public trust. And then they were gone. The 3 of them, Alistair, Isolde, and Marcus, vanished from public life. They sold the vast 1,000-acre property to a timber company in a private, unpublicized deal and disappeared. Their immense wealth laundered through a web of shell corporations and offshore accounts. They had committed hundreds of murders, engaged in human trafficking, and perpetrated massive fraud, and they had gotten away with it completely. Justice had not just been denied. It had never even been a remote possibility. In the decades that followed, the sanctuary was left to the slow, inexorable embrace of nature. The timber company logged the outer sections of the property, but left the core area around the main house and outbuildings untouched, deeming it too difficult to access. The grand Victorian mansion, once gleaming white, began to peel and rot. The roof sagged, windows shattered, and the relentless forest began its patient siege. The manicured lawns grew into tangled meadows, and the strange, exotic plants in Isolde's garden either died out or went feral, mingling with the native undergrowth. The place passed from history into folklore. Local teenagers would dare each other to visit the crumbling ruins, telling ghost stories about the spectral children said to haunt the decaying halls. It became a place of spooky legend, its true history lost, buried just a few feet beneath the forest floor. The truth of what happened there was preserved in only 2 places: in the forgotten, archived pages of Alara Vance's journal, and in the silent, waiting earth of the Appalachian Hills. The forest kept its secrets, the perfect accomplice to a crime that was, for all intents and purposes, perfect. The Ellingtons had succeeded in creating a black hole in history, a place where hundreds of lives had simply vanished without a trace. For more than 80 years, the secrets of the Ellington sanctuary lay dormant, guarded by the whispering pines and the forbidding reputation of the decaying estate. The story of the Ellingtons faded from public memory, reduced to a footnote in local histories that lauded Alistair as a great, if somewhat eccentric, philanthropist. The ghost stories remained, but the monstrous truth they unknowingly hinted at was lost to time. That all changed in the spring of 2024. A multinational logging corporation, having acquired the land decades prior, finally decided to move on the last, untouched 1,000-acre parcel. The plan was to clear-cut the area for a new timber out, a move protested by local environmental groups, but ultimately approved by county officials eager for the economic activity. It was on the 3rd day of this new operation that the past violently broke through into the present. A heavy-duty backhoe, tasked with clearing a path near the ruins of the main house, struck something that was not earth or stone. The operator, a man named Dave Pulaski, initially thought he'd hit an old water pipe or a buried foundation. He repositioned the machine's bucket and dug again. This time, he brought up a tangled mass of roots, dark soil, and something else. Something small, white, and disturbingly familiar. A human bone. The work stopped immediately. The site was cordoned off, and what began as a logging operation swiftly transformed into one of the largest and most complex forensic archaeological digs in the state's history. A team from the state university, led by a renowned forensic anthropologist named Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation, was brought in to oversee the excavation. What they began to uncover was a horror beyond anyone's darkest imagination. The first grave pit yielded the remains of a dozen individuals, mostly children and adolescents. Then a second pit was found a few yards away, then a third. The dig site expanded, revealing a vast, clandestine cemetery. The graves were shallow, unmarked, and dug with a chilling, systematic efficiency. They were not the orderly graves of a proper burial ground, but the hasty, layered pits of a mass disposal site. The final count was staggering. The partial or complete remains of 317 individuals were recovered. The initial forensic analysis. On site was a grim litany of suffering. The bones told stories of chronic malnutrition, of poorly healed fractures consistent with severe physical abuse, and of developmental abnormalities that hinted at unnatural causes. The science was beginning to echo the long-forgotten words of Alara Vance. It was at this point that a young, tenacious local historian and journalist, Sarah Jenkins, who was covering the discovery for a regional news outlet, made the connection that would blow the case wide open. While researching the history of the property, she stumbled upon a reference to the Vance Affair of 1924 in an old, digitized county newspaper. The article described the brief scandal involving a hysterical governess and the noble Dr. Ellington. Intrigued, Jenkins dug deeper, eventually locating Alara Vance's original sworn testimony and her journal, which had been filed away and forgotten in the county archives for nearly a century. She brought the journal to Dr. Thorne's team. It was the moment the past and present collided. The names on Alara's list of the vanished began to match the forensic profiles being assembled in the lab tent. Thomas, the boy who died of pneumonia, was identified by the estimated age and time of his disappearance. Anya, the girl sent to her uncle in Chicago, was found in a pit with others who had vanished in the same year. The journal provided the narrative, the context, the motive. The bones provided the irrefutable physical proof. Alara's testimony, dismissed as fantasy, was being vindicated, line by horrifying line, by the silent testimony of the dead. The modern uncoverer of truth had found the voice of the historical one, and together they began to piece together the full, terrible picture of what the Ellington family had truly wrought in their fortress of despair. The convergence of Alara Vance's century-old journal and the modern forensic evidence created a firestorm. The story of the Ellington Sanctuary exploded from a local curiosity into a national and international headline. The House of Horrors, as the media dubbed it, became a subject of intense fascination and revulsion. Documentaries were greenlit, true crime podcasts dedicated entire seasons to it, and Sarah Jenkins' reporting won her a Pulitzer Prize. The full horrifying picture was now crystal clear to the public. The charismatic leader, the methodical poisoner, the ruthless enforcer, and the systematic exploitation and murder of hundreds of children for profit and perverse scientific curiosity. With the what, how, and why now firmly established, the public and the legal system clamored for the final piece of the puzzle, justice. But this was the most tragic and frustrating chapter of the entire saga. Justice, in any conventional sense, was impossible. A thorough investigation into the lives of the Ellington trio after their retirement in 1937 revealed that they had lived out their days in quiet, immense, and undisturbed luxury. Alastair Ellington, under an assumed name, had become a reclusive but respected art collector in New England, dying of natural causes in 1968 at the age of 85. His obituary celebrated him as a quiet intellectual and connoisseur of fine art, with no mention of his past as a celebrated philanthropist, let alone a mass murderer. Isolde Ellington had joined him, passing away just 2 years later. Her death certificate lists the cause as heart failure. She lived a long life, never facing a single question about her restorative tonics or the secrets of her garden. Marcus Thorne, the brutal enforcer, proved the most elusive. He seemed to have vanished completely after 1937. However, investigators eventually found a death certificate for a man matching his description under a different name, who had worked as a security consultant for a private firm in Florida and died in 1971. The perpetrators of one of the most horrific serial killing enterprises in American history had all died peacefully in their beds of old age. They had never been caught, never been questioned, never been punished. They had won. This realization brought a profound sense of national outrage and helplessness. There could be no trial, no conviction, no sentencing. The architects of so much suffering were beyond the reach of the law, their crimes only coming to light long after they had escaped to the grave. The focus of the legal system then shifted to the only form of justice that remained: identifying the victims and, if possible, finding their living descendants. This launched a massive genealogical and DNA project, as teams of researchers tried to trace the origins of the children Marcus Thorne had brought to the sanctuary from cities across the nation. It was a monumental and heartbreaking task. For most of the victims, the trail was cold. They were, as the Ellingtons had intended, ghosts in the system, children of poor immigrants or broken families whose records were sparse or non-existent. But there were small, poignant victories. The DNA of a few victims was matched with distant relatives, great-nieces and great-nephews who had grown up hearing vague family stories of a child who had disappeared or been sent away during the Depression. For these families, the discovery was a devastating but validating revelation, solving a painful mystery that had lingered for generations. The story of the Ellingtons became a powerful and somber case study in the failure of the system. It was a stark reminder of how power, wealth, and charisma can weave a cloak of respectability so thick that it can conceal even the most monstrous of evils. Alastair Ellington's influence had not only allowed him to commit his crimes, but it also provided him with a powerful, built-in defense against the truth. He had weaponized his reputation, turning the very system meant to protect the innocent into an unwitting accomplice that discredited the one person who dared to speak up. The tragedy was not just in the number of lives lost, but in the number of years the truth remained buried, a silence bought with power and paid for by the forgotten. The excavation has long since concluded. The forensic tents are gone, the hum of scientific equipment replaced once again by the whispering of the wind through the skeletal trees. The Ellington Sanctuary, or what remains of it, now stands as a raw, open wound in the Appalachian landscape. The ruins of the main house and Isolde's greenhouse have been cordoned off, a permanent memorial to the horrors that transpired there. The land itself, consecrated by the suffering of hundreds of innocent souls, has become a place of somber pilgrimage. A simple granite monument has been erected, engraved not with an epitaph for the perpetrators, but with a dedication to the victims, bearing the words, "To the forgotten children of the Ellington Sanctuary. Your names are known to God. Your stories are now known to us. May you finally rest in peace." The legacy of the Ellington family is a complex and chilling tapestry. It is a story about the profound darkness that can fester behind a mask of benevolence, a cautionary tale about the seductive power of charisma when it is untethered from morality. Alastair Ellington was not a cartoon villain. He was a respected, admired, and powerful man. His evil was not an overt, snarling monstrosity, but a quiet, calculating, and patient malignancy that leveraged the trust and goodwill of society as its primary weapon. This case forces us to confront an unsettling question. How many other such stories remain buried beneath the foundations of our history? How many other sanctuaries, orphanages, or schools, founded with noble intentions, devolved into private kingdoms of abuse, their secrets protected by isolation and the social status of their founders? The victims of the Ellingtons were chosen for their vulnerability. They were orphans, immigrants, the poor, those without a voice, without connections, without anyone powerful enough to demand answers when they vanished. Their powerlessness was a prerequisite for the entire enterprise. The story serves as a tragic and eternal reminder that the true measure of a society's decency is not how it treats its most powerful citizens, but how it protects its most vulnerable. The darkness that consumed these children thrives in the shadows of indifference and the willful blindness of a society that often prefers a comforting lie to a difficult truth. So what is the final lesson to be drawn from this macabre chapter of our shared past? Perhaps it is a lesson in vigilance. A lesson that true evil rarely announces itself with thunder and lightning, but often arrives with a warm smile, a helping hand, and a promise of salvation. It is a call to question authority, to listen to the voices that are most easily dismissed, and to believe that even in the most idyllic-seeming places, the potential for profound darkness exists. As we close this investigation, we are left with the haunting silence of those unmarked graves and the faint, ghostly echo of Alara Vance's desperate, unheeded warnings. The case is closed, but the questions it raises will linger forever. What are your thoughts on this case? What does it say about the nature of power and the fragility of truth? Share your reflections in the comments below. Engage with this community of truth seekers. And if you believe these stories must be told, that the victims of the past deserve to be remembered, then please subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video. By keeping these stories alive, we honor the dead and arm the living with the knowledge to recognize the shadows when they fall again.